Welcome back to the Perfect Balance podcast. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, give this video a like and a share. And yeah, we are on episode 2. And in episode 2, I want to discuss a topic that a friend of mine called Adam, so shout out to Adam, he brought up this topic, and that is if you were to revisit the sport of gymnastics, what would you do differently? What would you train differently? And this is more of a strength and conditioning question than it is the actual skills and putting skills together. So one of the biggest things that I want to cover is, first of all, what the sport predominantly leans on in terms of the strengths of certainly men's artistic gymnastics, and then I'll talk through some of the muscle groups that I find personally are neglected and not really worked and focused on that could have a huge benefit to multiple skills, especially with floor, vault, and rings in particular. So I've stopped doing gymnastics for over 10 years now, coming up 15 years, between 10 to 15 years. Um, this question really got me into a deep rabbit hole sort of thing with Adam, and that was, so Adam is someone who's also done men's competitive gymnastics, and he was kind of picking my brains, and we were going backwards and forwards on this discussion. So one of the things that I had discussed with is sort of the injuries and the rehab and the prehab aspect of my journey since leaving the sport. And for those that know me, you'll know that since leaving the sport, I've gone into CrossFit and Olympic weightlifting side of things to keep myself healthy, keep myself fit. Um, he was picking my brains from the sort of knowledge of looking outside of gymnastics and looking at other sports and things like that. So while I was doing that, I was explaining the focus of muscle groups. So I'll go through that now. So the basis is in certainly throughout being a young 7 or 8, 9-year-old gymnast who starts their first competitions right up until senior men's, a lot of the focus and a lot of coaches fall into the anterior works. That means the front of the front of the body. So typically in the strength conditioning side, we focus a lot on the shoulders, the chest, the arms, the abs, maybe a little bit of legs, but nowhere near the upper body. Hence why gymnasts tend to have this inverted triangle sort of aesthetic look, which is important because we're looking for that strength and power to weight ratio. So we want to be as light as possible, but as strong as we possibly can to hold the frames for the bigger skills, in particular on rings. So for the likes of multis work, cross work, invert cross work, presses through different variations of strength, swings to strength. So we all, certainly when I was training, we kind of fell into that notion of you've got to continue to work those front muscle groups and work them, work them, work them, work them, and keep working them. Now, once I got to around 15, 16 years of age, I actually had a lower back injury, and there was a few boys in and around the time that I trained with who had gone through lower back injuries, recovered, some didn't recover. The other common injuries are wrist injuries, knee injuries, ankle injuries, things like that. But back injuries are quite prominent in gymnastics. There are a lot of skills that if you don't do sound technique and you don't work through good form, you can pretty much end your gymnastics career. So one of the things that I reflected on with Adam in this conversation through my injury, and I've thought about this over the years, is that if you look at Elliot Hulse, for those that have been following YouTube over the years, Elliot Hulse has the strength camp, I think, and he used to do Q&A, a lot of Q&As from coaches, from athletes, how to improve their strength conditioning. One of the things he used to say was, "Yeah, it sounds like you've picked up this particular overuse injury by what he called was movement pattern overload, which is where it's basically over repetitiveness, overuse of the same movement." So in my particular case, I was doing a forward element with a twist on floor. Um, it could be a magnitude of things. I will take the accountability that I wasn't executing the skill right. I was doing too much of the skill, and I probably didn't have a bulletproof lower back. So going back, touching on those frontal muscle groups, they could have also been, because obviously you've got antagonist and agonist muscle groups. Muscles tend to work off each other, to kind of work together and off each other. And if one's got a massive imbalance, then one's going to break down, whether that's from the front of the body to the back of the body. In my case, it was the lower back. Obviously, if you don't fill all the buckets equally and you don't bring all your levels up equally, you're going to have an imbalance, whether that's through gymnastics, football, tennis. Tennis players tend to overuse on one arm, so they get like we all know about tennis elbow and injuries from overuse of the same predominant arm and things like that. So muscle pattern overload, going back to that. The big highlight for gymnastics, if I was to go back to it and compete and get back into the sport, or if someone's to wave a wand and take me back to being, 16 years of age and entering into the senior competitions again, the posterior chain would be something that I would probably do a 180 on, and I'd focus more and do possibly more, but at least the same amount of volume and intensity and exercises on the posterior chain. That includes from the upper back, the mid back, the lower back, the glutes, the hamstrings, and the calves. And the reason I mentioned this to Adam was that at the time he was trying to get his crosswork and multis work, and he's still trying to improve on his isometric holds, which is basically what rings is all about in terms of being able to swing through certain skills and then hold strength movements from under a swing, or from some sort of in lower dislow movement, things like that, kipping movements. So I had mentioned it to him about, because he's sort of plateauing when it comes to multis, and I said, do you use any rows? Do you work on your upper back? Do you work on your traps and things like that? And he said no, and I said, well, do you use resistance training as well? And he was saying no, no, no. So I've said about incorporating those sort of movements in your workouts. Over time, he's starting to see the strength improvements and the improvements on those skills. And for me personally, for not only the upper back, so the upper back would help increase skills such as Maltese. Maltese is a big one. So working your chest, a lot of gymnasts would, for years and years and years, they would work biceps and their chest in terms of getting a Maltese. But Maltese also comes from doing lots of rows, making sure your trapeze and your lats are developed as well. Being able to hold whilst doing weighted rows, being able to hold the isometric hold portion of the row as well. So it's changing it up and never doing the same thing. So if you've seen episode 1, podcast of episode 1, where I talk about West Side Barbell and the conjugate system, if you can swap in and out exercises, which gymnastics coaches and senior gymnasts typically do anyway, but sometimes they also fall into, we get a little bit lazy and we fall into doing the same exercises because you think it's working, which they do, but they only work for a certain amount of time, and then you need to swap in and out different exercises to focus on different weaknesses. So I wish to, if I was to go back, I'd wish I'd have done more back extensions. I'd have done more dorsal raises. I'd have done more weighted variations of those low back exercises. A little bit more leg work, a little bit more glute work, a little bit more on the upper back. I never really worked upper back during my gymnastics career, and that's probably something that would have helped me and allowed me to do some of the certain skills that I was working on for crosswork and things like that. So yeah, the message is, the big one, the highlight is add loads and loads of posterior work, back work to your training. For the floor and vault in particular, there's so many vaults and tumbles and skills that go through an arch position, at such force, and it's such force. If you get that wrong and you're not doing sound form, your body's going to break down, and it's gonna pick up injuries and niggles and things like that. The back of the knee is something that I have worked on and noticed through doing CrossFit. Obviously, as I said at the start of this podcast, that if you work too much something of the muscles at the front, the muscles at the back become out balanced. And a big example of that is in the CrossFit and the weightlifting, because the quads become so developed, the front of the knee becomes tighter, and you get sore knees, especially when you're just beginning. So to rehab that and to work on that, it's important that you do lots and lots of banded banded curls. It needs to be a light band, doesn't need to be anything heavy, but it needs to. It's called flossing essentially, where it needs to flush out any DOMs, any sort of little muscle scar tissue and breakdowns, and it allows blood flow to get through the knees and to help recover the front, but at the same time to just balance the strength between the front of the knee and the back of the knee. So there's another posterior focus there for gymnasts and gymnastics coaches. The another skill that sticks out for me that would benefit back work is your giants on rings, especially going forwards. A lot of back injuries come from giants on rings, swinging from a handstand through the bottom. If gymnasts don't get that form done correctly, again, it's not a good ending. So there's another benefit there. I would say that the resistance training, so I'm 1.2 now. So this is a separate one, which I kind of touched on with the posterior work. Point two is adding more resistance training. Now, there's this big notion over certainly British gymnastics, and it's getting better. There's certain senior gymnasts over the last 10 to 15 years that have seen the benefits of resistance training, weight training to their own performance, especially when it comes to strength elements on rings, which stands out, some strength elements on floor, the improvement in endurance through gaining more strength, which naturally we all know that if you get stronger, it's easier to lift your own body weight, it's easier to lift certain weights, and your body's not having to take as much stamina and endurance out of it. And when I was doing my gymnastics when I was a lot younger, the resistance training was kind of unheard of. It was you become heavy, you don't want to be bulky and heavy and things like that, but it's just not true. Like if you are overeating and then you start resistance training, then yeah, you're gonna lose the specific capabilities to your performance. You're gonna become a too heavy of an athlete, which I understand why there was the notion over 10, 15 years ago to stay away from resistance training. But as long as if you're a senior gymnast in particular, you should be managing your nutrition well, especially in a discipline sport of gymnastics where, as I said before, the power to weight ratio is off. You just know in the gym when you're training that you feel heavier straight away. That's how fine of a sport gymnastics is, especially when it comes to strength work. So as long as you're within the body weight before doing any sort of resistance training is only going to be a positive to your performance. It's going to skyrocket your strength as long as you train proper and with the right form, as long as you've got a coach that knows what movements you should be working with the weights or with the resistance training. I would say that it's important. I would say it was important that you would either do that style of training in the off season in particular, and I would say at the end of sessions to help build that particular muscle area, whichever exercise you're working on. The guys that have done it in the past, and I'm talking, they're usually at national level or international level, have always been sort of pushed away from it. But when they have gone away and done it from their own time, their strength levels has massively increased. Now, the biggest problem with GB's athletes when it comes to ring strength in particular is that I wouldn't say we're weak, but we've never been the strongest nation on an international level. And I would say all the other countries that are very, very strong on rings are using resistance training. They are using weights. So for coaches need to relax a little bit. They need to look into it. They need to find the right balance, the perfect balance, as we say on this podcast, to really improve and keep ahead of the curve against other nations and things like that. And it'll bring this country's certainly strength elements higher through national levels, hopefully regional levels, and kind of like any sport, it will filter down to the grassroots level. So it's been kind of like a it's kind of like a, w- a sort of, how can I explain it? It's been something that's gymnasts and coaches have known about, but they've always shied away from it. And now that we're seeing more and more success and results through certain gymnasts over certainly in the last 10 years, more and more of it's being implemented into gymnastics. We've just got to be careful that we don't do too much of what we know as GPP versus SPP. So for those that don't know what that is general physical preparation, and then you've got your specific. So your specific strength in the sport of gymnastics would be a lot of it be based on your straight arm strength, so crosses, Maltese, and then your general prep will be typically your bent arm, straight arm work that has no sort of gymnastics elements. So it could be a barbell row, it could be a shrug, it can be bicep curls, things like that. The very general exercises that everyone can do. For me personally, I think that your GPP should still be relatively high so that you do not lose strength before competition. And that's probably going to sound controversial and it's getting into the nitty gritty things of strength conditioning. But as long as you periodize things and you plan things correctly, no coach should be dropping GPP at any point of the year. Um, but volume management in GPP versus SPP needs to be. I'll leave that for the coaches to figure out, and I'll leave that for your own opinions and your own philosophies. But I would say personally, don't ever drop GPP. Um, so yeah, so we've got working the posterior chain. We've got added resistance training. I'm trying to think, is there anything else I would change if I was to revisit the sport? I would say having records is something that I've discussed and touched on in the first podcast. A lot of the national squad gymnasts have had record books in the past. I know that in order to get onto the national squad in the pre-testing, they have to be able to. The gymnasts have to, at all different age groups, they have to hit minimum requirements of strength, speed, flexibility, and all that. So for me, I would have my own records. I would want to break records over the year, which again, a lot of coaches they have their own thing. They do that anyway. So there's and it kind of relates back to conjugate, and it kind of relates to just goal setting, keeping yourself motivated, goal setting, always having a goal, seeing where your performance is at, and being able to measure your performance. Hopefully, going in on an upward downward curve, but the trajectory is always going upwards and forwards. It's not always the case that the curve goes in a straight line and it goes straight up. Sometimes there are weaknesses that need more attention to detail in order for that curve to carry on going upwards and that performance to carry on going upwards. And but that's just the beauty. That's the beauty of coaching. That's the beauty of strength and conditioning. That's the beauty of what the best coaches in GB and the best coaches in the world are paid for and to figure out. But I'm just putting my 2 cents in on a conversation that someone who's a close friend of mine who's trying to improve his strength, and it was sort of picking my brains of knowledge from other, like I say, other sports. And yeah, there's certainly the three things being bulletproof posterior, add resistance training, and making sure your goal setting and goal management is there, and you can break records, and you can track you can track volume, you can track goals, you can track your intensity, you can write down how your body's feeling and make it more like a journal as well as numbers, so you're getting a qualitative sort of assessment on your own performance and things like that. So there's a lot to cover. I've only touched on a small segment of three different things, but yeah, that's what that's going to end the podcast there on the theme of, if I was to revisit the sport of men's artistic gymnastics, what would I do? Um, Hopefully that's answered a lot of questions for, certainly for Adam, certainly for the coaches or gymnasts or those that are watching, and you are an athlete and you do different sports, and you've got an insight to a sport that I used to do, and how I've gone from one sport of weightlifting back to a bodyweight sport of gymnastics, and how they correspond and can help each other out. So if you've liked this episode, make sure again you subscribe to the channel, give this channel a share, give this video a like, and that is episode 2 done. See you soon. Bye for now.